Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, along with my colleague Mike DeBernardis, partner at Hughes Hubbard, back for another issue of the Corruption Files. Today, we're going to take up the Och-Ziff case. And this case has so many interesting angles. It's a case that keeps on giving. It's still giving. 6 years after the initial enforcement action from October of 2016. Some of the background facts of this case include a pretty hefty fine and penalty payment of $415 million back then. At one point, it was in the top 10 of FCPA enforcement actions. There was a 3-year deferred prosecution agreement, a criminal plea on 4 counts, 2 FCPA conspiracy counts of books and records and internal controls component. There was an appointment of a 3-year monitorship. There were individual settlements with Och-Ziff's CEO Daniel Och for $2.2 million and the CFO, former CFO Joel Frank, for $35,000. One of the most interesting components of this case was actual restitution paid to investors in this case of $136 million. Och-Ziff no longer exists as a company today, and Mike's going to tell us about one of the individuals who came under some scrutiny and pain over this. It had some interesting bribery schemes involving someone who's identified as Israeli businessman number 1, who we now know to be Dan Gartner, and he was involved in corruption in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And then we had a huge amount of corruption in Libya with the Libyan Sovereign Wealth Fund, the Libyan Investment Authority. So lots of bribes paid, a lot of benefits to the first case involving hedge funds and private equity involved in this matter, and a juicy and delicious case. So, Mike, what interested you about this matter?
Oh man, am I limited to just one thing? Because there's plenty here. I think looking back on it after a number of years now, a few things sort of jumped out to me. One, and maybe this shouldn't be a surprise given that this was a very sophisticated hedge fund, very successful hedge fund. But just how complex the schemes were here. You really have to read through the charging documents a few times to understand exactly how the arrangements that Och-Ziff had made with Dan Gertler, with various schemes in Libya and other places as well. We're talking about margin calls and all kinds of things that are just not standard in FCPA cases. So that was one thing that stood out to me. And really, I think, give credit where credit's due. And I think the folks at the SEC and the DOJ who did this investigation, that there's a lot to unpack here and to wind down, and they seem to have done it really pretty well. The second piece, and I'm not looking, I don't have any inside knowledge here. I'm not looking to sort of put excuses out there, but I think it's interesting to view this in the context, not when the resolution happened in 2016, but when the conduct started, which was in the 07, 08 timeframe. You've got a hedge fund. We're just at the start of which become what's been termed the Great Recession. All the news is breaking about Lehman Brothers really struggling, Bear Stearns, all of the banks really struggling, and you had this situation for Och-Ziff where they're presented with these business opportunities, and to believe the SEC documents, at the very top, Daniel Och made the decision. He said, I know there's red flags, but you guys have told me about the red flags. Let's move forward anyway. This sounds like a place to make money. And I think, we often talk in the abstract about, hey, where crisis can breed opportunity for corruption, crisis can breed incentive for corruption. And looking back on it, this is potentially, a clean example of that. It's very easy to talk about that in the abstract. It's harder to kind of go back and show it. Those are two things that come to mind. But the other thing is this case, the tentacles kind of expand, and it really, I was mentioning to you before off air that it surprised me to realize that this was 2016. It seems like it was just yesterday, and I think that's partially because Dan Gertler's still in the news. They're still kind of working out issues with him. You have two executives at Och-Ziff who were charged by the SEC and fought it and actually ended up having their case dismissed because for statute of limitations reasons, and that just all happened in 2018. So this is still really being unpacked and is still very current today. And I think that's sort of a sign of how impactful and complex and wide-ranging this was.
So, Mike, I remember when we studied this case at the time, there were so many red flags apparent, and there were so many opportunities for Och-Ziff to stop the conduct either before there was any illegal action or even after it was discovered. It led me to believe that, was this really corruption starting at the top of the organization and permeating down throughout the organization, or was this something more around just missing internal controls or not looking hard enough?
Yeah, so I think there's different levels, and I think actually if the DOJ and SEC tried to sort of make it to differentiate a little bit, especially the SEC, right? I think the SEC's position was Daniel Och at the very top. He ignored red flags, all right, but he didn't have any direct knowledge of what was going on. But they had, there was definitely red flags. They were running reports, and they had information about Dan Gertler. I think I saw that one of the reports that got to Daniel Och's desk, warned that this guy has got really serious political connections in DRC, and he himself should be considered a PEP, a politically exposed person. And basically, these, if you're familiar with them, often these reports, stop short of making any final judgments and just provide you the information. But this report almost said, be very careful about dealing with this individual. And he had, his own people in his team, executives on his team saying, we shouldn't do this. This guy, we shouldn't touch this guy with a 10-foot pole. And Daniel Och, sort of made the decision, we're going to go for it anyway. Now, there's no evidence that was presented that he knew that bribes were paid or were going to be paid. It was just ignoring red flags. And then when you take a step down, though, you have the head of the London office, Cohen, and then one of the analysts who was really busy in Africa, Barrows, who that the SEC certainly made a case that both of them had absolute knowledge that these bribes were happening as they were issuing additional funding for the JVs in the DRC in particular, or providing additional money on capital calls and that type of thing. So I think it goes both ways. Obviously the internal controls weren't perfect, and Och-Ziff ended up they got a lot of credit for following this issue, improving their controls, and they had a monitorship to improve it. So obviously they weren't perfect, but they did catch a lot of the low-hanging fruit here, and I think it was for the most part pushed aside.
So there were you talked about the bribery schemes, and I wanted to focus on those for a few minutes because I think you're absolutely right. They were very sophisticated, as perhaps befitting a sophisticated private equity or hedge company or hedge fund. But there are also, I thought, some important lessons for the compliance professional around the fact of the sophistication of the bribery schemes. And I want to start with the DRC. And here we basically had a blank check given to Gertler in the form of a convertible loan. And internally, this was reviewed, and a loan to a potential joint venture partner or other partner is certainly an acceptable business practice, but it has to have an appropriate risk management strategy or compliance terms and conditions around it. Then we had it reviewed. Then it was reviewed by outside counsel, unidentified outside counsel in the settlement documents. But outside counsel suggested that protections be put in place, that the loan proceeds could not be used or could be used for a limited number of specific items, but it couldn't be broadened out to really anything. And that those suggestions were not put in place. And so for compliance professionals, they may not have looked at a convertible loan as potentially a pot of money to pay a bribe, but it shows, number one, you are only limited by your imagination in creating pots of money to pay bribes. And number two, that compliance professionals need to have visibility into not simply vetting due diligence partners, but the ongoing business relationships with joint venture partners, because the joint venture created in DRC, Och-Ziff was 40% owner, yet retained control over the joint venture. So how do you counsel clients to continue to review actions of a joint venture from the compliance perspective after the JV is signed and it's up and running?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, it's frankly, it's easier if you retain, even if as a minority shareholder, if you have control, it's much easier to sort of monitor, monitor everything, whether it's books and records of the joint venture, ensuring that the joint venture itself is operating under some sort of compliance apparatus, whether they have their own compliance policies and procedures or they're using the policies and procedures of the joint venture participant. And then, depending on the risk profile, especially when you're in control, doing audits. And that doesn't have to be a, hey, let's grab a team from a Big Four accounting firm and a law firm and send them out to DRC to pour through our books and records. There are things we talk to clients about all the time is there are various levels of auditing. That what I just mentioned is the highest level where you're really going in and you're turning the place upside down. But you can do spot checks on certain transactions. You can do sampling from a distance. There's everything in between. You could do an audit that's really focused on interviewing the employees and making sure they understand the compliance requirements and are following them. And that's a really good way to sort of keep an eye on an entity like a joint venture. It becomes more complicated when you are not in control of the joint venture. We often talk to clients when we can and try to work that out in advance of the forming the joint venture in terms of building in contractual protections, making sure your joint venture partner itself is willing to make sure that the joint venture is under strict control and make sure you find a joint venture partner that approaches compliance in the same way you do. So, but admittedly, it is far more complicated in a situation where maybe you don't have control of the JV.
So the loan ended up being literally just a blank check, and there were 3 or 4 indicia of bribes paid to the DRC government to obtain contracts from this joint venture. And it really speaks to what we've just talked about, the need for ongoing due diligence, but ongoing management of the relationship beyond the due diligence. And I often tell people that even if you go through the first 4 steps in the 5-step of the life cycle of a third-party agent, your work starts when the contract's signed. And for a joint venture, your work starts when the joint venture is formed and up and running. And I thought that was a great lesson also from the DRC aspect. Let me turn to Libya, because there we had a little bit more traditional bribery and corruption. Here we had a corrupt third-party agent who was used to secure investments with the Libyan Investment Authority, and we had someone who had no due diligence performed on them, and then no written contract. And literally millions of dollars were paid to this agent with the knowledge that it would be paid as a bribe. So once again, I don't think we can actually say enough about the need for due diligence around third parties, and then indicia of a real relationship. You don't have a written contract and you're a multi-million-dollar multinational company. That is unusual.
Yeah, and when I think if I have the numbers right, they paid this agent somewhere in the ballpark of $3.7 million or something. That's a big number to pay without a contract. That's not quite a a purchase order type number. Absolutely. This is, I think, for as complex as the conduct was in DRC, the conduct in Libya shapes up to be more of a traditional type of FCPA situation, right? They engaged an agent. They really wanted this investment from the Libyan Investment Authority. They engaged an agent. They said, "Hey, if we get this investment, you're going to make $4 million, whatever it was." They paid it out into, I think, the British Virgin Islands is where they ultimately paid the guy. So it kind of just all the red flags that you see typically in these third party situations were present in Libya, and it's really harder, where you can say in the DRC, all right, you ignored red flags. Ultimately, though, when you look at it, it was very complex how the corruption piece worked. This was a lot more straightforward, and I think this is one of the things that the SEC grabbed onto when they decided to charge Mr. Cohen, who was allegedly the sort of mastermind behind this and the one that was dealing with the agent. Was that this is pretty clear what was going on here.
This case also had one other very unique aspect, Mike, and that I mentioned that in the opening, which was restitution to investors. Restitution was paid under something called the Mandatory Victims Restitution Act, which allows restitution to victims of white-collar crimes, specifically including the FCPA. What is one of the hurdles that typically has to be overcome is to show direct harm from bribery and corruption of either the theft of a contract, theft of business, or something under the FCPA. And here, the restitution, when I say investors, I don't mean investors in Och-Ziff. I mean investors in a competitor who lost contracts in Libya due to the bribery and corruption of Och-Ziff. So we had a defined group of individuals, not a country. We had a defined set of contracts or business opportunities, and we had restitution paid to those companies or individuals who could show actual harm. And it may be a limited set of groups or individuals who can avail themselves of this going forward, but I think it really needs to be on every white-collar defense attorney's radar, and certainly the compliance professionals out there as well. Have you had discussions either internally or with clients about this possibility?
Honestly, not much. I mean, the reality is it's not used much. And it's one of the, if you there's a group that are a pretty large group that are pretty critical of the FCPA and kind of how it's used and how it's enforced. And I would say one of the complaints is, why is the U.S. government raking in, $200 million from Och-Ziff when they're not the ones who were harmed, right? It's a windfall in that sense. Shouldn't there be a bigger effort to make sure the money goes to victims, whether that's a defined group? I think that's one of the unique things of this case, and probably why it was used in this case, is that they could find a very specific and defined group, and they could calculate the exact harm, right? Which is part of the problem in a normal case. If you have a case with a corrupt minister in a country who's taken bribes for contracts, it can be hard to figure out, if you can say the general population's a victim, but it can be hard to sort of calculate what that would be and the actual mechanics about paying that back. But this is something that we know is out there as practitioners. The reason it's used so little, I think, in the FCPA context is because it really takes a very specific set of facts like we had here to make it work. I certainly would if as we were doing our investigation and sort of saw a fact pattern play out, would talk to a client about it as a possibility, but it's not one that I've had that's come up in the investigations I've done where we've had this sort of very defined group of victims that we thought this could come into play.
Mike, a lot of the commentary in 2016 when the enforcement action was initially announced was around the fact this was a private equity company, a hedge fund with numerous portfolio companies, and the emphasis was that private equity needed to have visibility and oversight over private equity companies, certainly from the compliance perspective. The fact that the SEC would take on what was in a major hedge fund and go to the mat to get this type of award or enforcement action, rather. Did you believe or find this to be really a change or something new that you needed to bring to a new set of companies or clients to make them aware of their potential exposure at that time? Or were you guys talking about this for a long time?
Yeah, I think I don't remember this being a sea change in the way we talked to clients or potential clients about it. I do know, especially when you think about it in terms of the portfolio companies, and I'm going to get it wrong. I think maybe in Gabon, there was they had a scheme that was really being executed by a portfolio company there. So this is a company that Och-Ziff had invested in, and basically they were charged with a lack of internal controls because they kept providing capital to this entity in Gabon, without confirming that this entity in Gabon was operating in the right way. And it turns out that the entity in Gabon was not, and they had hired an agent, were paying them millions of dollars, and likely for bribery. And so, we had and still do get questions from clients, whether they're in the financial sector, right, banks or whatever, about what's our exposure. If we're lending money, what's our exposure? If the recipient of those funds uses it inappropriately, if we are providing funds in this situation to a portfolio company, what's our exposure? And I think this case is an extreme example of it, but it provides that example to those clients of here's the outcome. Here is what can possibly happen if you're providing those funds without asking any questions or doing any proper diligence or making sure that there's controls in place for how those funds are used.
Like there was an increase, or rather a remedy. Part of the Och-Ziff's own remedy, which was approved by the SEC, was a list of requirements applicable to high risk transactions. And some of these, I think, are things we had seen before, but there were two that really struck me because in reviewing this matter for this podcast, because this was 2016, and I don't think we were talking about these items in 2016. Number one was checking and confirming due diligence on an ongoing basis. And then as part of that due diligence, also reviewing monies paid out by your business partners. So if you're in a joint venture, you're in another type of business partnership, exercising your audit rights and checking monies paid out. And thinking back, this is one of the first times I saw sort of the ongoing nature of these two. And those, I think, are almost accepted as standard or best practices now. Are those things you are still counseling clients to try to not only get in terms of compliance terms and conditions, but to exercise those rights?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't recall whether this is the first time I saw it or I had seen it before. Your memory is better than mine, but absolutely, this is now standard, especially when we're talking about higher risk third parties, which the ones that we're talking about in this case were, right? An agent being paid millions of dollars in Libya, that would go into a high risk category. A third party in the DRC. I've been there. It's a tough place to operate. An agent in Gabon, I think it was the former prime minister's son. That's where we're talking about the highest risk third parties, and so especially when we're talking in that category, it's almost a requirement when you're that category of risk to not only build in the audit rights but to exercise them. And again, there's when you're talking about audit rights in the same way as auditing a joint venture, when you're talking about auditing a third party, there's levels to it. And so it's not, I think a lot of companies get get scared off by this idea that it's this huge exercise and it's incredibly invasive. It can be. I mean, part of it's there's going to be some disruption and invasion involved, but checking payments of your third party can be really pretty quick. You can do it remotely, or having a regular. A lot of our clients have interviews by us before they engage a higher risk third party, so that we can ask the right questions and gauge whether the third party's been honest in the due diligence process. Having that happen again, on an annual basis, a biannual basis, however often. These are the kind of steps that we really encourage for the highest risk third parties to make sure that things are going the way you expected when you completed due diligence.
The issue of audit rights was a fair amount of discussion, certainly at the end of the first decade of this century and into the first half of the last decade. And my response was always the following. In 2006, for my sins, I was assigned to procurement at Halliburton. And they sent me over there, and it was a bunch of women in a room with stacks of documents. And when I went in and introduced myself, they all came over and hugged me because they said, "We've never had a lawyer before. This is great." So I learned about supply chain, and I started looking through these contracts. Every contract, and I want to emphasize the word every contract, had audit rights. And I tell people, in every procurement contract you always have audit rights. You always have the right to audit for any monies you've paid to assure that you receive those products or services. This is not new. It's simply now you're auditing to make sure the monies you paid have not been used to fund bribes or corruptions. And that sometimes was persuasive, but companies have always had audit rights. What you are correct in noting is they may not have exercised those rights. And I think that's what the DOJ really told us. This case was one of the cases that told us, but they've made clear you have to exercise those audit rights. And Och-Ziff makes clear in the high risk transactions, you do have to exercise those because you have to see where that money is going. So that's always a lesson that I draw from this case. Mike, this turned out to be a fascinating case in many ways. I frankly hadn't remembered just how crazy and insane it was and how important it was at that time. Do you have maybe any final thoughts on what it's meant to you and kind of reviewing it now in preparation for this podcast?
Yeah, it was great to go back and look at this. It was. I remember at the time having lots of conversations when this case came out, but that's not always the case, right? There's especially in the 2016, 2017 timeframe when we had just a lot of FCPA cases happening. But this one certainly caught our attention because it was different, right? We're talking about someone in the financial sector in a different way. The players were very large, right? Daniel Och himself is a very sort of large character. Gertler is like I said, if the listeners have an hour to spare, go and Google him and find recent stuff. He was sanctioned by the U.S., then got off the sanction during the Trump administration. It's been reinstated, and he's still, the U.S. is still sort of chasing him. You've got these agents in Libya and Gabon. So it was fascinating. I remember it being fascinating at the time. Going back and looking at it again, it was nice to remember why it was so fascinating in terms of the complexity and the sophistication of the bribery schemes, just the amounts involved, and just how sort of big and relevant this was. Really was interesting, and kind of just some of the lessons we've talked about, sort of remembering them and how they sort of stand out in this case was a really good exercise. I guess one more sort of nugget that I found in this case that I had forgotten about is one of the red flags that the charging documents talk about with respect to Gabon. Again, I think it was the former prime minister's son who was the agent there. He refused to sign anti-corruption certification, and they said, okay, whatever, we'll move forward anyway. And we that's pretty standard now. Those anti-corruption certifications for a lot of our clients basically do it for every contract they're going to enter into, and you sometimes get people joking or asking like, who's not going to sign this? Of course they're going to sign this, but it happens, right? It does happen. And if there's one sort of risk that I think I shouldn't limit it to one. Let me just say that to me, that's one of those, you're off the table. If you're not willing to sign this document to say that you won't violate anti-corruption laws, that's sort of a non-starter for me. There's a lot of other red flags that you can mitigate. That's not one of them. And it was funny to go back and realize that was part of this case. And it's a good example to give clients when they joke about how anybody would sign these documents.
This turned out to be a fascinating case, and I look forward to seeing what we come up with next time.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. It was fun.